Dr. Daniel Porter stood at the speaking platform in the center of the great council chamber. The room stretched upward for nearly 100 meters, filled with floating seats where representatives of 47 species watched him with varying degrees of interest and boredom. He had stood here many times before. He had made many speeches, but today felt different in a way he could not explain. A graphic display behind him showed three small planets on the outer edge of council space. Red warning symbols flashed around them. The Dominion had been moving closer to these worlds for months now. Their warships gathered at the border like wolves waiting for the right moment to strike. He cleared his throat and spoke in the calm voice he had practiced for 30 years of diplomatic service. He explained that human intelligence officers had confirmed the battle plan. He showed the council the projected invasion routes. He requested authorization for a defensive fleet to protect the colonists on those three worlds. Arbiter, the tall and silver-skinned leader of the council, raised one of his four hands to interrupt. His species, had led the council for over 2,000 years. They were ancient when humans still lived in caves. The Arbiter spoke with the pace of someone explaining something to a child. He said the council had reviewed human intelligence reports before. He said they often contained errors and exaggerations. He suggested that perhaps they were simply conducting military exercises near their own border, as they had every right to do. I felt his jaw tighten but kept his expression neutral. He had heard these dismissed before. Human intelligence was always questioned. Human concerns were always minimized. He asked the High Arbiter to at least consider sending observers to verify the threat. Of the spoke next. The were a warrior species with scales the color of dried blood and teeth designed for tearing flesh, and never hidden his contempt for humanity. He laughed at the idea of human militarists. He reminded the council that humans had only achieved space travel a century ago. He said perhaps humans should focus on their designated roles as meteors and logistic coordinators rather than pretending to understand warfare. Delegates from other species made sounds of a grin. Daniel noticed that none of the humans in the observation gallery showed any reaction. They had heard these insults too many times to feel them anymore. Cole, the chief analyst, sat in the human section with her hands folded in her lap. She had prepared the threat assessment that the council now dismissed. She had spent 3 months gathering data from 17 different sources. None of that mattered to the beings in this room. Grove flowed forward on her anti-gravity platform. There were small creatures with huge eyes and delicate wings that no longer functioned in standard gravity. They controlled most of the trade networks in council space, had a new proposal she wished to discuss. Explained that the Trade Coalition had been reviewing resource allocation across council space. She had determined that human trade routes were underperforming compared to prediction. She proposed transferring management of these routes to control. She said this with a smile that showed no teeth, as if she were offering a gift rather than taking something away. I stared at her for a long moment. Humans had built those trade routes over 60 years of hard work. Human ships had mapped the safe path through asteroid fields and radiation zones. Human negotiators had secured the agreements that made commerce possible between species who had been enemies for. Lisa Grant, watching from the military liaison section, leaned forward in her seat. She recognized the look on the ambassador's face. It was the look of a man reaching the end of his patience. While Shaw, seated beside her, received a priority message on his personal communicator. He read it twice to make sure he understood correctly. Then he passed it silently to Commander Grant. Her eyes widened as she read the words. The speaking platform, Daniel received the same message on his own device. He looked down at the small screen for what seemed like a very long time. The chamber grew quiet. Even the most dismissive delegates could sense that something had changed. He put the device back in his pocket. He looked up at the High Arbiter with an expression that revealed nothing. Then he spoke in a voice that carried to every corner of the massive room. A step by order of the United Earth Government, humanity formally from all council operations, treaties, and mutual defense agreements. The withdrawal was effective immediately. All human personnel would evacuate council facilities within 72 hours. He thanked the council for 8 years of cooperation and wished them well in their future endeavors. Silence that followed was absolute. 47 species stared at the human ambassador as if he had suddenly grown a second head. A step down from the speaking platform. He walked toward the exit without looking back. His footsteps echoed in the vast chamber. Around the room, human delegates and observers rose from their seats and followed him. They moved quietly and efficiently, as humans always did. Cole gathered her day tablets and joined the exodus. Commander Grant and Admiral Shaw fell in step behind the ambassador. No one spoke. No one needed to. Arbiter finally found his voice. He called out to the departing humans, asking if there was some kind of negotiating tactic. He received no response. He demanded that Ambassador Porter return to explain this outrageous behavior. The doors closed behind the last human delegate. Snorted with contempt. He said the council was better off without the humans. They had always been more trouble than they were worth. Their ships were slow. Their technology was primitive. Their endless requests for meetings and discussions wasted everyone's time. Baker agreed enthusiastically. She said that what happened would take over human responsibilities. It would be good for efficiency, good for profits, good for everyone. Arbiter settled back in his floating throne. He announced that the council would continue its business without interruption. The human departure was unfortunate but ultimately insignificant. The great machine of galactic civilization would continue to function as it always had. On the chamber, delegates returned to their private conversations and political maneuvering. The threat assessment was filed away for future review. The question of defensive fleets was tabled indefinitely. Everything returned to normal. Of them noticed that the translation systems had begun showing small errors. None of them realized that the client controls were running 3% less efficiently. None of them understood that 1,000 tiny systems they had never thought about were already starting to fail. Humans were gone, and the council had no idea what that truly meant. Weeks had passed since the humans left, and Commander Lead Grant stood on the observation deck of the last human transport ship departing next prime. She watched the great station grow smaller through the viewport, its lights twinkling against the darkness of space. For 60 years, humans had lived and worked on that station. Now it felt like looking at a stranger's home. Departure had been orderly and quiet. Humans packed their belongings, said goodbye to colleagues of other species, and boarded their ships without drama. Some of the aliens they had worked with seemed confused. Others seemed relieved. Most simply watched them go with expressions that revealed nothing. And her communication officer reported incoming transmissions from the station. 3 separate species were requesting technical assistance with their docking system. The automated protocols were generating errors that no one knew how to fix. Commander Grant ordered the officer to send polite refusals to all requests. They were no longer council members. They were no longer responsible for council problems. Next prime, chaos bloomed like a flower opening to poison sunlight. The Trade Coalition had confidently assumed control of translation services between species. What they discovered in the first week shocked them. Human linguists had been maintaining over 4,000 separate translation protocols, each one carefully adjusted for cultural context and diplomatic sensitivity. Made systems translated words accurately, but missed the subtle meanings beneath them. A routine trade negotiation between the and the collapsed into screaming accusations when a phrase meaning deep respect in one language was translated as mild tolerance in another. 2 centuries of careful relationship building unraveled in an afternoon. Her demanded her technicians fix the problems immediately. They worked without sleep for 5 days. The situation only grew worse. Species that had cooperated peacefully for generations began viewing each other with suspicion. Every conversation carried the risk of unintended insult. Stationed across continental space reported a different kind of crisis. Human doctors and researchers had been quietly donating biological samples for decades. Human blood could be processed into emergency treatments for 12 different species. Human tissue cultures supported research into diseases that affected billions of beings. Samples had always been given freely. No one had kept careful records of how much was needed or how often supplies were replenished. Now the donations stopped, and hospitals began rationing treatments that had always been available. Patients who would have recovered easily began dying from conditions that should have been simple to treat. While Shaw positioned the human fleet at the edge of continental space, just inside the boundary of Earth-controlled territory, his ship maintained perfect formation and complete silence. Requests for military consultation arrived every hour from species who had mocked human hackable abilities just weeks before. 17 separate messages asking for advice on fleet coordination exercises. Admiral Shaw read each one carefully and filed them away without response. He felt no satisfaction in their desperation. He simply followed his orders. Humanity had withdrawn. Humanity would stay withdrawn until circumstances changed. Circumstances changed badly for the 2 weeks later. Their military command decided to conduct a large-scale training exercise without human hackable advisors. For decades, humans had quietly managed the communication networks that allowed ships to coordinate their movements. No one had realized how dependent the system had become on human oversight. Heavy cruisers collided during a simulated attack run. The explosion killed 200 warriors instantly. Another 50 died in the rescue operation that followed. Delegate, who had laughed at human military capabilities in the council chamber, stood in silence as the casualty report scrolled across his command screen. Arbiter began receiving reports from across council space. Infrastructure failures like a disease spreading through a weakened body. Power grids fluctuated on 17 different worlds. Water purification systems malfunctioned on space stations that had operated perfectly for centuries. Emergency services struggled to respond to crises that would have been handled smoothly just months before. Humans had done so much that no one ever noticed. They had fixed small problems before they became large ones. They had mediated disputes before they became conflicts. They had maintained systems that everyone assumed maintained themselves. Their quiet competence had been invisible, and now their absence created gaps that no one knew how to fill. Cole monitored council communications from her new office on Earth. The official statements remained confident. The council was adapting to new circumstances. The human departure was a minor inconvenience being handled efficiently, but beneath the official channels, she detected rising panic in the private messages between species. After Daniel Porter spent his days in meetings with Earth government officials, explaining what the council was likely experiencing and what they might do in response. He took no pleasure in being proven right about the threat. He took no pleasure in watching the organization he had served for 30 years stumble and fall. West commanded a patrol vessel on the border between human space and continental territory. Every day, ships appeared at the boundary carrying refugees. Civilians from 5 different species fled the growing chaos, begging for human protection. His orders were clear. He could provide humanitarian assistance but could not intervene in council affairs. G's told stories of food shortages and medical emergencies and conflicts between neighbors who had lived in peace for generations. They spoke of the humans they had known, the ones who had helped them without asking for thanks, the ones who had left without explaining why. Some of them wept as they told these stories. The Dominion struck. Their warships crossed the border and descended on the outer rim colonies that Ambassador Porter had warned about. The colony worlds had no defenses. The colonial fleet was scattered and disorganized, unable to coordinate a response through communication systems that had been degrading for weeks. Arbiter called an emergency session of the council. For the first time in his long career, he faced a crisis he did not know how to solve. The enemy was at the gates, the alliance was fracturing, and the beings who had always quietly solved these problems were gone. Look at the empty seats where the human delegation had once sat. He remembered dismissing their concerns as primitive and unformed. He remembered laughing when they, confident that the council would manage without them. The council had not managed, the council was failing, and they were coming. Weeks after the human withdrawal, Captain West watched another wave of refugee ships approach the border station. His crew had processed over 40,000 displaced beings in the past month. They came from dozens of species, crowded into vessels never designed for so many handlers. They came with nothing but fear and desperate hope. We drifted past him in the processing corridor, their children clinging to their parents with tiny hands. The father stopped and looked at Captain West with those huge, sorrowful eyes. He asked why the humans had left. He said humans had always been kind to his people. He did not understand what his government had done to drive them away. West had no answer that would comfort the man. He directed the family toward the refugee housing section and moved on to the next group waiting for processing. There was always another group. There was always more suffering to witness. In council space, the Dominion celebrated their victories. 2 colony worlds had fallen in 8 days. The defenders had fought bravely but without coordination. Their fleets arrived in scattered groups that they destroyed one by one. Their communications were filled with confusion and contradictory orders. Manners had expected more resistance. They had studied human tactical doctrine and prepared for coordinated counterattacks. Instead, they found chaos. They found enemies who could not talk to each other, who did not trust each other, who blamed each other for every failure. The conquest was almost too easy to be satisfying. Rage in the council chamber, demanding action that no one could provide. He slammed his scaled fists against the speaking platform and accused the other species of cowardice and incompetence. He demanded that the council find a way to force the humans to return. Arbiter responded with the patience of exhaustion. He explained that humans had never signed treaties requiring them to serve the council. They had joined voluntarily 8 years ago. They had contributed voluntarily for all that time, and they had left voluntarily when the council made clear that their contributions were not valued. There was no legal mechanism to compel their return. There was no leverage to use against them. The humans controlled their own territory and their own fleet. They owed the council nothing. And to know why humans had been allowed such independence. Surely someone had foreseen the possibility. Surely someone had planned for the day when humans might decide to leave. The chamber fell silent. No one had planned for that day because no one had believed it would come. Humans were reliable. Humans were helpful. Humans showed up and did the work and never complained. The idea that they might simply stop had never occurred to anyone. Faced her own crisis as the trade networks continued to collapse. Supply ships sat idle in ports where no one could negotiate the paperwork required to move cargo. Three species face fan because food shipments could not reach them through the bureaucratic tangles that humans had always quietly untangled. Adhering negotiators from other species to replace the human meteors. They were too arrogant to compromise. They were too aggressive to build trust. The smaller species lacked the influence to pressure larger ones into agreement. Every alternative failed where humans had succeeded. The border between and space, an ancient dispute over a mining system, erupted into armed confrontation. Both species had claimed the system for centuries. Human meteors had maintained a careful balance that allowed both to benefit. Without that balance, old hatreds resurfaced with terrifying speed. Ships from both species gathered at the contested border. Insults were exchanged. Weapons were armed. The council that had governed 47 species faced the possibility of civil war. Mr. Daniel Porter watched the situation unfold from Earth. He had spent his career believing in the council, believing that cooperation between species was possible, believing that patience and goodwill could overcome any obstacle. Now he watched that belief crumble into ash. Received reports from Dr. Cole about conditions across council space, hospitals running out of medicine, power stations failing without warning, security forces unable to communicate during emergencies. The fabric of galactic civilization was tearing apart thread by thread. Cole asked if he thought humanity should intervene. She said people were dying, children were starving. Surely humans could not simply watch and do nothing. Reminded her that humans had tried to help for 8 years. They had given everything they had to the council. They had worked themselves to exhaustion maintaining systems that others took for granted, and the council had responded with contempt and dismissal. Asked what would change if humans returned now. The council had not learned anything. They had not changed their attitudes. They would simply expect humans to clean up the mess and then go back to treating them as servants. The cycle would repeat until humans broke under the strain. And Elisa Grant faced a harder choice at the border station. A delegation of 12 species had arrived with a formal request for humanitarian aid. They did not demand. They did not threat. They simply asked with humility that would have been unmanageable 6 weeks before. People were suffering. Their governments were failing. They had nowhere else to turn. They understood that humans owed them nothing. They asked anyway because asking was all they had left. Consulted with Admiral Shaw and Ambassador Porter. The debate lasted hours. Some argued that helping would only enable the council's dysfunction. Others argued that innocent beings should not suffer for the arrogance of their leaders. There was no easy answer. They could reach a decision. New reports arrived from the front lines. The Dominion had announced their next target. They would attack Next Prime itself, the heart of the Galactic Council, the symbol of cooperation between species for over 3,000 years. Next Prime fell, the council would collapse completely. 47 species would be left to fate alone, divided and weak and utterly unrepaired. Dr. Grant looked at the delegation waiting for her answer. She saw fear in their alien eyes. She saw hope struggling against despair. She saw beings who had finally realized what they had lost. Told them humanity would consider their request. She could promise nothing more. The decision was not hers to make. The delegation thanked her with desperate gratitude. They had expected to be turned away. Even the possibility of help seemed like a miracle. Watched them return to their ships and wondered what kind of species humanity wanted to be. They could stand aside and watch the council burn. They had earned that right through decades of thankless service. No one would blame them for choosing safety over sacrifice. Humans had never been good at watching others suffer. It was their greatest strength and their most dangerous weakness. Except for the withdrawal, High Arbiter did something no leader of the had done in 2,000 years. He traveled to another species to ask for help. His personal vessel crossed the border into human space and requested permission to dock at the orbital station above Earth. The request caused considerable debate among human leadership. Some wanted to turn him away without a hearing. Others argued that refusing to meet would make humanity no better than the council that had dismissed them. Ambassador Daniel Porter argued for a meeting. He said they should at least hear what the High Arbiter had to say. It took place in a small conference room with plain walls and simple furniture. No floating thrones or towering chambers designed to intimidate. Just a table and chairs and two beings who had once stood on opposite sides of a great divide. Older than Porter remembered. The silver skin that had always gleamed with health now appeared dull and tired. The 4 arms that had gestured with such authority now hung limply at his sides. He moved like a being carrying a weight too heavy to bear. Offered him a seat and weighed in silence. He would not make this easy. The High Arbiter had come to ask for something, and he would have to find the words himself. Well, to begin, he explained that he had never apologized to anyone in his 200 years of political service. His species considered apology a sign of weakness. Leaders did not admit mistakes. Leaders did not show vulnerability. He had come to admit a mistake. He had come to show vulnerability, because without human help, everything he had spent his life building would be destroyed. Apologized for dismissing human intelligence reports. He apologized for allowing other delegates to mock human capabilities. He apologized for treating humans as servants rather than partners. He apologized for taking human contributions for granted while offering nothing but contempt in return. Listened without expression. He had waited 30 years to hear these words. Now that they came, he felt only sadness. He produced a data tablet and began reading a list. It contained every human contribution to council operations that his staff had been able to identify. The list was long. It took 20 minutes to read. It had maintained translation systems for 4,000 language era. Humans had coordinated medical research that saved billions of lives across 12 species. Humans had managed supply chains that kept hundreds of worlds fed. Humans had mediated disputes that would have become wars. Humans had fixed problems that no one else even noticed. Council had received all of this freely, complained about the quality, and demanded more. They had never once said thank you. Asked what the High Arbiter wanted from humanity now, said he wanted help defending Next Prime. The fleet would arrive in 3 days. Council defenses were in shambles. Without human tactical coordination, the station would fall. Asked what would change if humanity returned. Would the Council treat them as equals? Would their contributions be recognized and valued? Or would everything simply return to the way it was before? Not guarantee anything. He was one voice among 47 species. Many delegates still resented human capabilities. Many still believed they could manage without human assistance. Changing their minds would take time that no one had. Admiral Shaw entered the room with a data tablet of his own. He showed the latest intelligence on the fleet, 200 warships, 50 troop transports, enough firepower to reduce Next Prime to rubble in hours. Asked how the Council planned to defend against such force, admitted they had no coherent plan. Their fleets could not communicate effectively. Their commanders did not trust each other. Their supply lines were broken. Cole joined the meeting with her own assessment. She explained what the council had never understood about humanity. Humans did not serve for recognition or reward. They served because they believed in something larger than themselves. They believed that different species could work together to build a better galaxy. The council had killed that belief. They had shown humans that their faith was misplaced. They had proven that cooperation meant exploitation. They had taught humans to protect themselves instead of sacrificing for others. Asked if there was any hope of changing human minds, Cole said humans were stubborn creatures. Once they lost faith in something, they rarely found it again. But they were also compassionate creatures. They could not easily watch others suffer, even others who had hurt them. And Elisa Grant received a report from the border station. Despite the official withdrawal, human civilians had begun volunteering for relief missions. Doctors were treating refugees. Engineers were repairing broken systems. Teachers were caring for orphan children. It had been ordered to withdraw, but humans could not stop being themselves. Their nature drove them to help even when their government told them to stand aside. Considered everything he had heard. He thought about the humans who had served the council for 80 years without recognition. He thought about the ones who had died in the line of duty without even a note of thanks in council records. He thought about what they would want him to do. Told he would contact Earth with a recommendation. He could not promise what the response would be. Humanity had been hurt deeply. Trust was not rebuilt with a single apology. He understood. He thanked Porter for listening, which was more than he deserved. He returned to his ship and waited for an answer that might never come. Sat alone in the conference room after everyone else had left. He thought about duty and sacrifice and what it meant to be human. He thought about revenge and justice and whether they were truly different things. He wrote his recommendation and sent it to Earth. The response came faster than he expected. Humanity would return to Next Prime, but not as servants, not as helpers, not as the quiet workers who fixed problems while others took credit. They would come as equals or not at all. The message was clear. The Council could accept human help on human terms, or the Council could face the alone. The choice was theirs. The fleet arrived at Next Prime on the morning of the third day. 200 ships dropped out of fat than light travel in perfect formation, their hulls gleaming against the backdrop of stars. They came not as council servants returning to duty, but as independent allies with specific conditions for their assistance. While Shaw transmitted those conditions to every ship in the system, human forces would operate under human command. Human tactical decisions would not be questioned or overruled. Human contributions would be formally recognized in all official records. Any species that refused these terms could defend themselves without human assistance. The Council accepted within minutes. They had no other choice. The tactical command of the combined defense fleet by unanimous request. His first order reorganized the chaotic mass of ships into coordinated strike groups, cruisers paired with destroyers, got ships linked with heavy carriers from 6 different species. For the first time in weeks, the fleet moved as a single organism rather than a collection of confused fragments. I've expecting easy victory. They found something very different. Their advanced scouts reported a defense formation unlike anything in their intelligence files. Ships that should have been enemies fought together with perfect coordination. Communications that should have been scrambled flowed clearly through human-maintained networks. Battle began with assault on the outer defense perimeter. Admiral Shaw had positioned his weakest ships there, creating the appearance of vulnerability, but committed their fastest attack wings to exploit the apparent weakness. Flew directly into a trap. Hidden behind sensor-blocking asteroids, the heavy cruisers of 5 species waited in ambush. The attack wings died in crossfire so precise that enemy pilots had no time to even call for help. West led a strike team of human marines toward the command vessel. Their mission was to disable the enemy flagship and throw the invasion fleet into disarray. It was dangerous work that required skills no other species possessed. Marines had trained for boarding actions in conditions that would kill most other beings. They could fight in vacuum. They could operate in temperatures that would freeze blood or boil scales. They could keep fighting after injuries that would incapacitate any other species. And his team breached the command ship through an auxiliary airlock. They moved through corridors designed for creatures twice their size, using their small frames to slip through spaces the defenders could not follow. They reached the bridge in 11 minutes and took control in 3 more. Fleet lost coordination as their command ship went silent. Individual captains made individual decisions, and those decisions contradicted each other. Ships that should have supported each other fired into empty space, while human-coordinated squadrons picked them apart. Cole provided a different kind of weapon. She had spent weeks analyzing communications and discovered a critical weakness. The Dominion soldiers believed their leaders were invincible. They believed the galaxy was weak and divided and ripe for conquest. Broadcast a message to every ship in the system. The message was simple. It showed their command ship under human control. It showed their attack wings burning in the wreckage of the ambush. It showed their invasion fleet being systematically destroyed by the alliance they had dismissed as broken. The psychological impact was devastating. Crews who had expected easy victory found themselves facing deterrent resistance and mounting losses. Their faith in their leaders crumbled. Their confidence in their cause collapsed. Ships began retreating before their captain gave the order. Elisa Grant coordinated the civilian evacuation while the battle raged around Next Prime. Refugee ships carrying beings from 20 different species fled toward safe zones that human navigators had mapped. Supply vessels distributed food and medicine that human logistics officers had organized. Did the work of 50 council administrators without complaint, just as humans had always done. But this time, every species watching knew exactly who was responsible for their survival. Flagship exploded when Captain West triggered its reactor overload. The blast vaporized 3 enemy cruisers that had moved to recapture the vessel. With their command structure destroyed and their fleet in chaos, the remaining ships fled toward the border. Battle of Next Prime was over. The council had survived, and everyone knew who had saved them. The aftermath, Ambassador Daniel Porter addressed the council once more. He stood at the same speaking platform where he had announced humanity's withdrawal 2 months before. The chamber looked different now. The delegates who had dismissed him watched with respect that bordered on awe. Did not gloat. He did not remind them of their arrogance or their mistakes. He simply stated that humanity would participate in the council as equals, with full recognition of their contributions, or humanity would not participate at all. There would be no return to the old arrangement. There would be no more invisible service. There would be no more thankless sacrifice. Arbiter rose from his floating throne. He proposed a new charter recognizing human contributions to galactic civilization. He proposed formal inclusion of humans in all council decision-making bodies. He proposed that the date of the Battle of Next Prime become an annual celebration of cooperation between species. Vote was unanimous. 47 species agreed without a single objection. Ian Duggett, his scale still marked with wounds from the battle, voted in favor. accepted the charter on behalf of humanity. He thanked the council for their recognition, but reminded them that words meant nothing without action. The true test would come in the months and years ahead. Humanity would be watching to see if the council had truly changed. Let's filed out of the chamber slowly, many of them starting to speak with human observers they had ignored for decades. Conversations that should have happened years ago finally began. Relationships that should have been partnerships finally started to form. Walked through the rebuilt council chambers as the crowd dispersed. PEs who had once dismissed human now nodded with genuine respect. Some even offered thanks, stumbling over words their languages had rarely needed to express. Thought about all the humans who had served the council for 8 years without recognition, the engineers who kept the systems running, the doctors who healed the sick, the mediators who prevented wars, the countless quiet workers who gave everything and received nothing in return. They deserved to see them moan. They deserved to know that their sacrifice had meaning. They deserved to understand that walking away had accomplished what staying never could. Returned to his quarters and composed a message to Earth. He kept it simple because simple words carried the most truth. Finally understand, we were never their servants, we were their conscience, and a conscience cannot be commanded, it can only be earned. Sent the message and looked out his window at the stars. Somewhere out there they were regrouping. Somewhere out there, new threats were gathering. The galaxy remained dangerous and uncertain, and full of challenges that no single species could face alone. For the first time in 8 years, humanity faced those challenges as equals, not because they had demanded respect with weapons or threats, but because they had earned it by walking away. The strongest thing you can do is step back without a word. Sometimes silence speaks louder than any argument. Sometimes you have to let people fail before they can learn to value what they lost. And he had learned that lesson long ago. Now the council had learned it too. The galaxy would never be the same.